Why you wouldn't survive a medieval duel. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of medieval honor, where a misplaced word could end your life, where justice was decided by the sharpness of your blade, and where the difference between being right and being dead often came down to whether you could swing a sword without tripping over your own feet. Welcome to the surprisingly bureaucratic, oddly ritualized, and absolutely lethal world of the medieval duel. You're about to discover why these weren't romantic affairs of honor, but carefully orchestrated legal procedures that happen to end with someone bleeding in the dirt. The rooster hasn't even bothered to crow yet, and you're already awake staring at the rough wooden beams of your ceiling. There's no sunlight creeping through the shutters, just the cold gray promise of dawn and the metallic taste of fear coating your tongue like bad ale. You roll over on your straw mattress, feeling every lump and poke through the thin fabric. Your back aches from sleeping on what essentially amounts to organized hay, but that's the least of your problems today. Today, you're going to fight for your life in what medieval society calls trial by combat, and what you're beginning to realize should probably be called trial by stupidity. The air in your small chamber is thick with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and that peculiar medieval combination of human sweat and animal musk that seems to permeate everything. Your breath forms small clouds in the cold air as you sit up, rubbing your hands together for warmth. Through the thin wooden walls, you can hear the sounds of the town beginning to wake. The baker's already at work. You can smell bread baking, which, under normal circumstances, would make your stomach growl. Today, it just reminds you that this might be the last morning you ever smell fresh bread. A cow lows somewhere in the distance, probably annoyed at being milked before sunrise. Dogs bark at shadows and strangers. A cart creaks along the cobblestones, its wooden wheels clicking rhythmically against the uneven stone. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, sounds that suggest the world plans to continue existing even if you don't. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and immediately regret it as your bare feet hit the cold wooden floor. The floorboards creak under your weight. Everything in medieval times creaks, groans, or squeaks as if the very buildings are slowly dying of old age and want you to know about it. Your clothes are laid out where you left them last night, a rough woolen tunic that scratches against your skin like an apology woolen hose that never quite fit right, and leather boots that have seen better decades. The leather is cracked and stained, patched in several places with whatever scraps you could find. These aren't the boots of a knight or nobleman. These are the boots of someone who works for a living, someone who probably shouldn't be preparing to fight a duel at all. As you dress, your hands shake slightly. Not from cold, though the morning air is bitter enough to make your teeth chatter. You're shaking because in a few hours, you'll be standing in a field holding a weapon, facing another human being who fully intends to kill you. And according to medieval law, this is justice. The irony isn't lost on you. You're about to risk your life to prove you're innocent of a crime using a system that could kill you even if you're right. It's like taking a final exam where a wrong answer doesn't just fail you, it ends you. You splash water from a wooden basin onto your face. The water is cold enough to make you gasp, and it tastes faintly of the wooden bucket it was stored in. Everything in medieval times tastes like wood, actually. Bread tastes like wood. Ale tastes like wood. Even the air seems to have a woody aftertaste, probably because half the world is made of the stuff. As you dry your face with a rough cloth that feels like it was woven from tree bark, you catch sight of yourself in the small, warped piece of polished metal that serves as your mirror. The reflection is dim and distorted, but you can see enough to note that you look exactly like someone who's about to die in a duel, which is to say terrified and slightly green around the edges. Your stomach churns, but not from hunger. From the knowledge that in medieval society, trial by combat isn't just some barbaric custom. It's an actual legal procedure, complete with rules, regulations, and paperwork. Someone somewhere has filed documents about your impending death. There's probably a clerk making notes about it in careful Latin script, noting the time, the place the weapon's allowed, and whether your next of kin need to be notified. The thought would be funny if it weren't so horrifying. Let's back up a bit and explain how you got into this mess, because medieval dueling didn't just happen spontaneously. You couldn't just walk up to someone and challenge them to mortal combat because they looked at you funny. Well, you could, but you'd probably be arrested for disturbing the peace and possibly executed for being an idiot. Medieval dueling was a legal process, as formal and regulated as any court proceeding. More regulated, actually, because court proceedings rarely involved swords and the explicit expectation that someone would die. Your trouble started 3 weeks ago in the market square. You were buying turnips. Not because you particularly wanted turnips, but because turnips were what you could afford, and in medieval times you ate what you could afford, or you didn't eat at all. The turnip seller, a man named Godwin, who had the personality of a particularly unpleasant root vegetable, accused you of shortchanging him. This wasn't just an accusation of poor arithmetic. In medieval society, calling someone a cheat or a thief was serious business. It was an attack on your honor, your reputation, and your ability to do business in the community. If word got around that you were dishonest, you might find yourself unable to buy bread, unable to find work, unable to rent a room. Your reputation was literally your livelihood. So when Godwin loudly proclaimed that you were a lying, cheating, turnip-stealing scoundrel, you had two choices: accept the accusation and become a social pariah, or challenge his claim. Unfortunately, challenging his claim in medieval society didn't mean producing receipts or calling for a manager. It meant demanding satisfaction through trial by combat. The process was surprisingly bureaucratic. First, you had to formally accuse Godwin of making false statements, essentially calling him a liar in return. This wasn't just shouting at each other in the market square. This was a legal process that required witnesses' formal statements and probably someone who could write things down in Latin. Then Godwin had the right to demand trial by combat to prove his accusations were true, which he did probably while grinning like a man who'd been looking forward to legally stabbing someone all his life. The local magistrate, a tired-looking man who clearly dealt with this sort of thing more often than he'd like, officially sanctioned the combat. A date was set, rules were established, weapons were chosen, and you who had started the day just trying to buy vegetables suddenly found yourself scheduled for legal homicide. The weapons chosen were swords and small shields because apparently someone thought this was a reasonable way to determine whether you had correctly counted your coins. The location was designated as the field outside the town walls because medieval society was thoughtful enough not to want blood splattered all over the market square where people were trying to sell food. And the rules, oh, the rules were delightfully specific. The combat would begin at sunrise. Both parties would be searched for hidden weapons or armor beyond what was agreed upon. A priest would be present to hear final confessions because medieval society was practical about these things. The fight would continue until one party yielded, was unable to continue, or died. The winner would be declared truthful by divine judgment. The loser would be declared a liar by the same divine judgment, assuming they were still alive to care. It was in its own twisted way a perfectly logical system. If God was just, then the truthful party would be given strength to prevail. If someone died during the combat, it simply proved that God had found them wanting. The system was foolproof assuming you ignored the rather obvious flaw that it killed people. But here's the thing about medieval justice. It wasn't really about finding the truth. It was about ending disputes. Two people couldn't agree on whether you had stolen a coin's worth of turnips, so society provided a definitive way to settle the matter. One of you would die and the other would be considered correct. Problem solved, case closed. Someone please clean up the blood. As you sit in your cold room pulling on your boots and contemplating your mortality, you can't help but think that maybe you should have just paid the extra coin, even if you hadn't actually shortchanged him, even if Godwin was lying through his remaining teeth. Because being right isn't worth much if you're too dead to enjoy it. But it's too late for such reasonable thoughts now. The challenge has been made, the combat sanctioned, and the priest probably already has his last rites prepared. In a few hours, you'll walk out to that field and discover whether God thinks you're an honest turnip buyer or not. You're betting your life that he does. As you finish dressing in the pre-dawn darkness, your mind turns to the weapon you'll be wielding in a few hours. It's leaning against the wall in the corner of your room, a sword that's seen better decades with a leather-wrapped handle worn smooth by countless hands, and a blade that's been sharpened so many times it's probably lighter than when it was forged. This isn't the gleaming, perfectly balanced weapon of knightly romance. This is a working sword, a tool designed for the messy business of cutting through human flesh and bone. The blade is about 3 feet long, double-edged, with a simple cross guard to protect your hands. It weighs roughly 3 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you try swinging it around for more than a few minutes. The sword represents centuries of metallurgical evolution, though that's probably not much comfort as you contemplate using it to kill another person. Medieval bladesmiths had turned sword making into an art form, not because they were romantic about violence, but because their customers' lives depended on their work. The blade was forged from iron that had been heated, hammered, folded, and hammered again, driving out impurities and creating a weapon that could hold an edge while remaining flexible enough not to shatter on impact. The process took weeks and required skills passed down through generations of smiths who understood that a poorly made sword was essentially an expensive way to commit suicide. Your sword has a groove running down the center of the blade, not for blood to flow out as popular mythology suggests, but to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. Medieval engineers understood that a lighter weapon was faster to swing and less tiring to wield, which could mean the difference between life and death in extended combat. The handle is designed to fit your hand perfectly wrapped in leather that provides grip even when wet with sweat or blood. The pommel at the end isn't just decorative, it serves as a counterweight to the blade and can be used as a weapon itself if you find yourself pressed too close to your opponent to use the blade effectively. But owning a sword and knowing how to use it are entirely different skills, and medieval combat training was a brutal education in applied physics and anatomy. If you were wealthy enough, you might have trained with a master-at-arms who taught proper stance footwork and the dozens of specific techniques required to survive armed combat. You would have learned to read your opponent's movements, to anticipate attacks, to exploit openings, and to end fights quickly before exhaustion made you vulnerable. But you're not wealthy, which means your combat training consists of whatever you picked up from other poor people who also didn't know what they were doing. You've swung your sword at fence posts and hay bales. You've practiced basic cuts and thrusts. You know which end to hold and which end to stick in the other person. Beyond that, you're relying on luck adrenaline in the hope that your opponent is even less competent than you are. Medieval combat was not the graceful dance portrayed in modern films. It was exhausting, terrifying, and over quickly. Most fights lasted less than a minute, not because of dramatic, decisive blows, but because swinging a 3-pound piece of metal while wearing armor and trying not to die is incredibly tiring. The human body, it turns out, is surprisingly fragile when confronted with sharp steel. A properly delivered sword blow could cut through muscle, sever arteries, or break bones. Medieval physicians had extensive knowledge of combat wounds because they saw so many of them, and their medical texts read like horror novels written by someone with a disturbing knowledge of anatomy. A cut to the arm could sever tendons, making it impossible to grip a weapon. A thrust to the torso could puncture organs, causing internal bleeding that would kill slowly and painfully. A blow to the head could crack the skull, causing immediate unconsciousness or death. Medieval combat manuals cataloged dozens of ways to efficiently kill another human being, written in the same matter-of-fact tone used for recipes or farming instructions. Your small shield, called a buckler, is your only defense beyond your sword. It's roughly 18 inches across, made of wood, covered with leather, and reinforced with metal studs. It's designed to deflect or absorb blows that would otherwise remove important parts of your body. Using it effectively requires timing, positioning, and the ability to think clearly while someone is trying to kill you. The shield can also be used offensively to bash your opponent, knock them off balance, or create openings for your sword. Medieval combat treatises described elaborate techniques combining sword and shield work with names like the ox guard and the fool's parry, though most actual combat devolved into desperate attempts to hit the other person while avoiding being hit yourself. As you pick up your sword and test its weight in your hand, you're reminded that this weapon was designed with a single purpose: to make other people stop living. There's no getting around the brutal mathematics of medieval combat. One of you will walk away from this fight and one of you won't. The sword doesn't care about justice, honor, or who was right about the turnips. It only cares about physics, anatomy, and the skill of the person wielding it. And in a few hours, you'll discover whether you have enough skill to keep breathing. If you were a wealthy knight or nobleman, you'd be preparing for combat by strapping on hundreds of pounds of carefully crafted steel armor, each piece designed to deflect blows and keep your vital organs safely inside your body where they belong. You'd have a team of servants helping you into articulated plate mail that cost more than most people earned in their entire lives. But you're not a wealthy knight. You're someone who started this whole mess by arguing about turnip money, which means your armor consists of whatever you could afford, borrow, or steal without being caught. Your primary protection is a gambeson, a padded jacket made of layers of linen stuffed with cotton wool or whatever soft material was available. It looks like a quilted nightgown designed by someone who'd never seen a nightgown, and it's about as glamorous as it sounds. But don't let appearances fool you. A good gambeson could absorb the impact of sword blows, prevent cuts from reaching your skin, and distribute the force of impacts across your body. The padding is thick enough to stop most slashing attacks and reduce the damage from thrusting attacks, though it won't stop a determined sword thrust delivered with sufficient force. Medieval armor was about reducing damage, not eliminating it entirely. The goal was to turn a fatal wound into a survivable one, or a crippling injury into something you could walk away from. Over the gambeson, you're wearing a mail shirt or hauberk that you borrowed from a friend who'd inherited it from his father, who'd probably inherited it from his father. The mail consists of thousands of interlocking iron rings, each about the size of a fingernail, woven together to create a flexible metal fabric. Making mail armor was incredibly labor-intensive. Each ring had to be individually forged, cut-shaped, and linked to its neighbors. A single hauberk might contain 20,000 rings and take months to complete. The result was armor that could flex with your body movements while providing excellent protection against cuts and slashes. But mail had its limitations. It was heavy. Your hauberk weighs about 30 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you try moving quickly while wearing it. It was also vulnerable to thrusting attacks, which could force the rings apart and penetrate to the body beneath. And it was expensive to maintain, requiring regular cleaning and oiling to prevent rust. The mail hangs to your knees and has long sleeves that cover your arms to the wrists. There's a coif, a mail hood, that protects your head and neck, though it makes you look like a metal monk and tends to muffle sounds, which could be a problem when someone's shouting warnings about incoming sword blows. Your hands are protected by leather gloves reinforced with metal studs. They're not the articulated steel gauntlets of wealthy knights, but they'll keep your fingers attached to your hands, which is probably the most you can hope for, given your budget. Your legs are protected by mail chausses, essentially mail stockings, that cover your thighs and shins. They're held up by leather straps attached to your belt, and they have an annoying tendency to sag during combat, which can trip you up at precisely the wrong moment. On your feet, you're wearing leather boots reinforced with metal plates over the toes. Medieval combat involved a lot of stepping on things. Rocks, mud, blood, occasionally your opponent's feet, and proper footwear could mean the difference between maintaining your balance and falling face first into a sword. All of this armor weighs roughly 50 pounds distributed across your entire body. It's not the crushing weight that makes movement impossible, but it's enough to slow you down, tire you out faster, and make every action require more effort. Medieval knights trained for years to fight effectively in armor, learning to move efficiently and conserve energy. You've had 3 weeks to practice, which is roughly 3 weeks less than you needed. The armor also affects your vision and hearing. The mail coif restricts your peripheral vision, and the weight of the armor changes your balance and center of gravity. Sounds are muffled, which means you might not hear your opponent's footsteps or the warnings of spectators. Medieval combat required not just physical skill, but the ability to adapt to fighting while essentially wearing a metal straitjacket. But perhaps most importantly, the armor provides psychological protection. There's something reassuring about being wrapped in steel, even if you intellectually understand that it won't make you invulnerable. The weight and bulk of the armor makes you feel more substantial, more protected, more like someone who might actually survive the next few hours. Of course, your opponent is wearing similar armor, which means that your protection is also his protection. Medieval combat between armored opponents was often a lengthy process of trying to find gaps in the armor, wear down the opponent through exhaustion, or deliver blows powerful enough to cause damage through the metal. As you adjust the straps and buckles of your armor in the dim pre-dawn light, you're reminded that every piece was designed by someone who understood that violence was a fundamental part of medieval life. This wasn't ceremonial armor or decorative metalwork. This was functional protection designed to keep you alive in a world where disputes were settled with steel. Whether it will actually keep you alive remains to be seen. The sun is finally beginning to rise as you make your way through the town toward the designated combat field. The streets are mostly empty, save for a few early risers who stop and stare as you pass. Word has gotten around, as word always does in small communities, and everyone knows that today someone is going to die over turnips. Your armor clanks softly with each step, the mail rings shifting against each other with a sound like distant rain. The sword at your side bounces against your leg, a constant reminder of what's about to happen. Your breath steams in the cold morning air, and you can feel sweat beginning to form under the padded gambeson despite the chill. The field chosen for the combat is outside the town walls, a flat area of grass kept short by grazing sheep. It's perhaps 50 yards square, surrounded by a low stone wall that serves as seating for spectators. And there are spectators, more than you expected. Word of a trial by combat draws crowds like a market day or a hanging, and for many of the same reasons. Medieval society didn't have television, newspapers, or public entertainment beyond what the community created for itself. A legal duel was drama, sport, and moral instruction all rolled into one bloody package. People brought their families, packed lunches, and settled in to watch justice take its course. The officials are already present, standing near a wooden table that's been set up at one end of the field. There's the magistrate who sanctioned the combat, looking like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. There's a priest in brown robes clutching a leather-bound Bible and trying to look spiritually prepared for whatever is about to happen. There are 2 men-at-arms who'll ensure that the rules are followed and that no one interferes with the proceedings. And there's a clerk with parchment ink and quills ready to record the proceedings for posterity. Because medieval bureaucracy was thorough even when it came to legally sanctioned homicide. Your opponent Godwin is already present, and he looks considerably more confident than you feel. He's older, grizzled, with scars on his arms that suggest he's done this sort of thing before. His armor is similar to yours, but better maintained, and he handles his weapon with the casual familiarity of someone who's comfortable with violence. He nods to you as you approach, not friendly exactly, but acknowledging your presence with the professional courtesy of someone about to try to kill you. There's something almost businesslike about the gesture, as if you're two craftsmen meeting to discuss a particularly challenging project. The magistrate calls both parties forward and begins reading from a scroll. The language is formal, full of legal terminology and references to divine judgment. The essence is simple. You've accused each other of lying. You've agreed to settle the matter through combat, and may God grant victory to whoever is telling the truth. The reading takes nearly 10 minutes, during which you stand in your armor, trying not to think about the fact that this might be the last formal document you ever hear. The priest adds his own prayers, asking for divine guidance and a just outcome. The spectators remain respectfully quiet, though you can sense their anticipation. Finally, the weapons are inspected. Your sword is examined for any modifications or enhancements beyond what was agreed upon. Your shield is checked for hidden spikes or illegal reinforcements. The same process is repeated for your opponent. Everything is found to be in order, which means there are no more delays, no more preparations, no more reasons to postpone what's about to happen. The rules are explained one final time. The combat will continue until one party yields, is unable to continue, or dies. Yielding requires a clear verbal surrender that all present can hear. If you fall and cannot rise, the combat is over. If you drop your weapon and cannot retrieve it, the combat is over. If you die, the combat is definitely over. There will be no interference from spectators. No one will provide assistance, advice, or weapons. This is between you, your opponent, and divine judgment. The boundaries of the combat area are clearly marked. If either fighter leaves the designated area, they will be considered to have fled the field and will forfeit by default. The victor may choose to spare a defeated opponent's life, but there's no requirement to do so. Both parties are asked if they have any final statements or confessions. Your opponent declines. You mumble something about hoping this will be settled quickly and fairly, which earns a few sympathetic murmurs from the crowd. The priest offers last rites to both participants. This isn't unusual. Medieval society was practical about the likelihood that someone would die during trial by combat. Better to prepare souls for the afterlife than to risk eternal damnation over procedural oversights. You kneel in the grass, still wearing your armor, and listen to Latin prayers that you don't fully understand but find oddly comforting. The familiar rhythm of the words, the priest's calm voice, the smell of incense from a small portable brazier. It all feels surreal, like preparation for a ceremony rather than a fight to the death. Then it's over. The prayers are finished, the formalities are complete, and everyone steps back to the edges of the field. You and your opponent are left standing roughly 10 yards apart, weapons in hand, with nothing between you but grass, morning mist, and the absolute certainty that one of you will not survive the next few minutes. The magistrate raises his hand and calls out the traditional words, "Let God's will be done," and then he drops his hand and the killing begins. The first thing you notice is how quiet everything becomes. The crowd, which had been murmuring and shifting restlessly, falls silent. Even the birds seem to stop singing. All you can hear is your own breathing, loud and harsh, inside the male coif, and the sound of your heart beating so hard you're amazed it doesn't show through the armor. Godwin begins circling to your right, his sword held low, his shield positioned to protect his torso. He moves with the careful, measured steps of someone who's done this before, never crossing his feet, always maintaining his balance. His eyes never leave yours, and there's something almost hypnotic about his steady, predatory gaze. You mirror his movement, circling to your left, trying to remember everything you've ever heard about sword fighting. Keep your guard up, watch his eyes. Don't let him get behind you. Don't trip over your own feet. The advice seems inadequate now that you're actually facing someone who wants to kill you. Medieval combat wasn't the dramatic athletic sword work you see in movies. Real fighting with real weapons was cautious, calculated, and brief. Both fighters knew that a single mistake could be fatal, so they probed for weaknesses, tested defenses, and waited for opportunities. Godwin makes the first move, a quick thrust toward your chest that you barely manage to deflect with your shield. The point of his sword scrapes along the metal rim with a sound like fingernails on slate, and you realize with shocking clarity that if you'd been a fraction of a second slower, you'd already be dead. You respond with a clumsy overhead swing that he easily sidesteps your sword, whistling through empty air. The miss throws you slightly off balance, and you have to take a quick step backward to avoid his immediate counterattack. The crowd gasps. Apparently, your near-death experience was visible to the spectators, even if you barely understood what had happened. There's something deeply unsettling about having an audience for your potential murder, especially an audience that seems to be enjoying the show. Combat becomes a series of brief, violent exchanges separated by longer periods of cautious maneuvering. Godwin attacks you, defend or dodge. You attack, he parries or steps away. Neither of you wants to commit to a full assault that might leave you open to a counterattack, but neither of you can afford to remain purely defensive. The armor that seemed so protective when you put it on this morning now feels like a burden. It's hot inside the mail and padding, and sweat runs down your face and into your eyes. The weight of the metal slows your movements and tires your muscles faster than you expected. Your breathing becomes labored after just a few minutes of fighting. Each swing of your sword requires more effort than the last, and your shield arm begins to ache from absorbing impacts. Medieval combat was as much about endurance as skill. The fighter who tired first was usually the fighter who died. Godwin seems to understand this better than you do. His attacks are economical, precise, designed to make you work harder than necessary. He forces you to move, to block, to swing, and miss, gradually wearing down your strength while conserving his own. You try a different approach, attempting to use your shield more aggressively, pushing forward and trying to knock him off balance. For a moment it works. He stumbles backward and you see an opening for a thrust to his midsection. But medieval combat was full of traps for the unwary. As you commit to the attack, Godwin recovers his balance and brings his sword around in a horizontal cut aimed at your neck. You barely get your shield up in time, and his blade rings against the metal reinforcement with enough force to numb your arm. The impact sends you staggering sideways, and suddenly Godwin is inside your guard, too close for sword work, but perfectly positioned to grab you, trip you, or find a gap in your armor with a dagger. Medieval fighting manuals devoted entire chapters to close-quarters grappling because armed combat often devolved into wrestling matches between exhausted, armored opponents. You manage to break away, pushing him back with your shield and creating enough space to use your sword again, but the exchange has cost you. Your breathing is ragged now, and your movements are becoming slower and less coordinated. The mail that protects you also traps your body heat, and you're beginning to feel lightheaded from exertion and dehydration. Medieval fighters understood that combat was ultimately about creating and exploiting moments of advantage. A slight stumble, a moment of inattention, a small gap in armor or guard, these tiny opportunities could determine who lived and who died. Godwin creates his opportunity by feinting an attack to your left side, causing you to shift your shield to block. But the real attack comes from the right, a quick thrust aimed at the gap between your arm and torso, where the mail might not provide complete protection. You twist away at the last second, feeling the point of his sword scrape along your ribs through the padding. It doesn't penetrate, but the closeness of it sends a shock of terror through your system that's almost paralyzing. And that's when you make your mistake. In your panic to get away from his blade, you take a step backward without looking, and your foot lands on a patch of dew-wet grass. Your legs shoot out from under you, and you crash onto your back with a tremendous clatter of mail and weapons. Medieval armor was designed for fighting upright, not for getting up from the ground. The weight and bulk that provided protection now work against you as you struggle to rise. Your sword is still in your hand, but it's awkward to use from this position. Your shield is trapped beneath you, useless. And Godwin is standing over you, his sword point aimed at your throat with victory written clearly on his scarred face. Time slows to a crawl as you lie on your back in the wet grass, looking up at Godwin's sword point hovering inches from your throat. The blade is steady in his hand. No trembling, no hesitation, just cold steel poised to end your life with a single downward thrust. The crowd has gone completely silent. Even the wind seems to have stopped. You can hear your own labored breathing, the creak of leather and mail as Godwin shifts his stance, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a church bell marking the hour. Medieval trial by combat had a terrible logic to it. You've been defeated in fair fight, which according to the legal philosophy of the time, proves that God has found you wanting. Your defeat is divine judgment rendered visible through mortal combat. The truth of your dispute with Godwin has been determined by the strength of his sword arm and your inability to keep your footing on wet grass. But defeat didn't automatically mean death. Medieval law recognized that the victor had the right to spare a defeated opponent, though there was no requirement to do so. Mercy was entirely at the discretion of the winner, and mercy was often expensive. Godwin looks down at you with what might be satisfaction or might be professional assessment. He's breathing hard from the combat, but not as hard as you are. Sweat runs down his face, but his sword hand remains steady. He's done this before you realize. This isn't his first trial by combat, and it probably won't be his last. "Do you yield?" he asks, his voice carrying clearly across the silent field. Medieval surrenders had to be unambiguous. A mumbled plea might not be heard or accepted. Yielding required a clear verbal admission of defeat that all present could witness. It was both a legal formality and a public humiliation, an acknowledgement that you had been wrong, that your opponent had been right, and that divine judgment had spoken through combat. You try to speak, but your throat is dry and constricted with fear. The mail coif muffles your first attempt, and you have to try again before the words come out clearly. "I yield." The magistrate calls out the formal conclusion. The combat is ended. Divine judgment has been rendered. Let all present witness that Godwin speaks truthfully in this matter. Which is medieval legal language for you were wrong about the turnips, and everyone now knows it. But you're alive, which seemed unlikely a few moments ago. Godwin steps back and sheathes his sword, not out of kindness, but because the legal requirements of trial by combat have been satisfied. The dispute is settled, justice has been served, and there's no need for further violence. Getting to your feet while wearing 50 pounds of armor is more difficult than it looks, especially when your legs are shaking from exhaustion and fear. The mail hauberk has shifted during the fight and now hangs awkwardly binding your movements. Your shield arm aches from absorbing sword blows, and you can feel bruises forming where the armor didn't quite prevent impacts. The crowd begins to disperse, chattering excitedly about what they've witnessed. For them, this was entertainment, a dramatic break from the routine of medieval life. For you, it was nearly death over the price of root vegetables. Medieval society viewed trial by combat as a legitimate form of justice, but it was justice with a distinctly practical edge. The system didn't really determine truth. It determined who was stronger, more skilled, or luckier. But it did resolve disputes definitively, which was often more important than absolute accuracy. The priest approaches to offer prayers of thanksgiving for your survival, which feels somewhat ironic, given that the same religious system that sanctioned your near execution is now celebrating your continued existence. Medieval Christianity had a complicated relationship with violence, officially opposed to bloodshed, but practically accepting of it when properly regulated and legally sanctioned. The financial implications of your defeat are beginning to sink in as you remove your armor. In addition to the public humiliation of being proven wrong, you now owe Godwin compensation for the false accusation. The exact amount will be determined by the magistrate, but it will likely be several times the original disputed sum. Medieval justice was expensive for the guilty party. Court cost compensation to the victor, fees for the officials who supervised the combat, and potentially fines to the local authority, all had to be paid. A dispute that started over a few coins could end up costing you months of wages, but money at least was something you could potentially earn back. Your reputation was another matter entirely. Word of your defeat would spread throughout the community and beyond. Everyone would know that you had been publicly proven a liar and a cheat through divine judgment. Future business dealings would be affected, social relationships would change, and your standing in the community would be permanently diminished. Medieval society was built on reputation and trust. A man's word was literally his bond, and once that word was proven false through legal combat, restoring credibility became nearly impossible. You might be alive, but your social death was almost as complete as if Godwin's sword had found its mark. As you walk back toward town, still wearing your battered armor and carrying your unused shield, you reflect on the strange logic of the system you've just experienced. Trial by combat didn't determine truth, but it did provide certainty. The community now knew definitively how the dispute should be resolved. There would be no appeals, no lengthy legal proceedings, no uncertainty about the outcome. Medieval society valued this kind of finality over the messier process of actually investigating facts. It was more important to have a clear resolution than a necessarily accurate one, especially for disputes that couldn't be easily proven through evidence or testimony. The irony, of course, is that your defeat proves nothing about whether you actually shortchanged Godwin. It only proves that he was better at sword fighting than you were. But medieval legal philosophy held that God would ensure victory for the truthful party-making combat results, a form of divine revelation. Whether God was paying attention to turnip transactions was apparently not a question medieval theologians felt needed answering. As you finally reach your small dwelling and begin the painful process of removing your armor, you're confronted with the practical realities of medieval life after legal defeat. The mail hauberk that seemed so protective this morning now feels like a metal prison, and every buckle and strap fights you as you try to get free of it. Your body aches in places you didn't know could ache. The padding of the gambeson is soaked with sweat, and the leather straps have left deep marks on your shoulders and arms. Medieval armor was effective protection, but wearing it was a form of torture in itself, especially for someone who wasn't accustomed to its weight and restrictions. But physical discomfort is the least of your problems. The financial consequences of your defeat are mounting, even as you sit on your straw mattress trying to work feeling back into your arms. First, there's the compensation owed to Godwin. The magistrate has ruled that you must pay him not only the original disputed amount, which you maintain you didn't actually owe, but additional damages for the false accusation. This comes to roughly a month's wages for someone of your social class. Then there are the court costs. The magistrate, the priest, the men-at-arms, and the clerk all expect payment for their services. Medieval justice was not free, and the losing party bore the financial burden of the entire proceeding. Another week's wages at minimum. The weapons and armor you used must be maintained and potentially repaired. Your sword needs sharpening after its contact with Godwin's blade and shield. The mail needs cleaning and oiling to prevent rust. The leather straps and buckles need attention. If you'd been seriously wounded, you'd also face the cost of medical treatment, which in medieval times was expensive and not notably effective. Medieval physicians had limited knowledge of anatomy and virtually no understanding of infection or disease transmission. Their treatments often involved bleeding, purging, or applying various herbal concoctions that were more likely to harm than help. Surgery was performed without anesthesia or sterile techniques, making it nearly as dangerous as the original injury. Fortunately, your pride was wounded more severely than your body, though pride doesn't pay for food or rent. The economic impact extends beyond the immediate costs. Your reputation for honesty has been destroyed through public defeat in legal combat. This will affect your ability to conduct business, borrow money, or even rent lodging. Medieval society operated on trust and personal relationships, and both had been permanently damaged. Merchants might demand payment in advance rather than extending credit. Employers might question your reliability. Landlords might require additional security deposits. The social and economic networks that made medieval life possible were built on reputation, and yours was now in ruins. Medieval communities were small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business. News of your defeat would spread quickly through informal networks of gossip conversation and storytelling. By evening, everyone in town would know that you had been proven a liar and a cheat through divine judgment. By the end of the week, the story would have reached neighboring communities. The stigma would follow you for years, possibly for the rest of your life. Medieval society had long memories for public failures, especially those involving dishonesty or cowardice. Children would be told stories about the man who tried to cheat the turnip seller and was struck down by God's justice. Your defeat would become a moral lesson, a cautionary tale about the dangers of dishonesty. But perhaps most frustrating of all, you still maintain that you didn't actually shortchange Godwin in the first place. The combat proved nothing about the original transaction, only that he was better with a sword than you were. Medieval justice confused might with right combat skill with moral truth and physical victory with divine approval. You could have been completely honest about the turnip transaction and still lost the combat simply because you slipped on wet grass. Conversely, Godwin could have been lying from the beginning and still won through superior fighting ability. The system provided certainty and finality, but not necessarily accuracy or fairness. As you sit in your small room counting the coins you'll need to pay for your defeat, you wonder if there might have been a better way to handle the original dispute. Perhaps you could have simply accepted Godwin's accusation and paid the extra money he demanded. It would have been unfair, but it would have been cheaper than the cost of proving your innocence through combat. Or perhaps you could have found witnesses to the original transaction people who could have testified about what actually happened in the market square. Medieval justice did allow for witness testimony in some cases, though it was considered less reliable than divine judgment through combat. But these are the thoughts of someone who now understands the true cost of medieval justice. This morning you were focused on defending your honor and reputation. Now you're calculating whether you can afford to keep living in the same community. Medieval society offered few second chances for those who fell from grace. Once your reputation was destroyed, rebuilding it was nearly impossible. Your best option might be to leave entirely to seek a new life in a different community where your defeat was unknown and your past could be reinvented. But even that escape carried risks. Medieval travelers were viewed with suspicion, especially those who couldn't provide good reasons for leaving their home communities. A man fleeing the consequences of legal defeat might find that his problems followed him wherever he went. The sun is setting as you finish removing your armor and count the coins in your small leather purse. You have enough to pay the immediate costs of your defeat, but not much beyond that. Tomorrow, you'll need to begin the process of rebuilding your life, finding new sources of income, and somehow restoring your place in a community that now knows you as a proven liar. It's going to be a long, difficult process, but at least you're alive to attempt it, which seemed unlikely just a few hours ago. 3 days after your defeat, you're summoned back to the magistrate's chamber to complete the legal formalities of your trial by combat. Medieval justice might have been decided by swords, but it was documented by clerks, and every detail of your humiliation must be properly recorded for posterity. The chamber is a small stone room above the town's market hall with narrow windows that let in just enough light to work by. The walls are lined with wooden shelves holding rolls of parchment-bound ledgers and various legal documents tied with ribbon. The smell of ink, parchment, and old leather fills the air, along with the faint odor of the fish market below. The magistrate sits behind a heavy wooden table, looking tired and slightly annoyed at having to deal with the aftermath of your combat. He's a practical man who's seen dozens of these cases, and to him, you're just another entry in the legal records, another dispute resolved through sanctioned violence. The clerk sits at a smaller table to one side, carefully copying the final judgment onto parchment in his neat Latin script. Medieval legal documents were works of art as much as legal instruments, with elaborate initial letters and precise calligraphy that would survive for centuries. The matter of the disputed payment between Godwin the turnip seller and yourself has been resolved through trial by combat. The magistrate begins reading from his notes. Divine judgment has been rendered. You have been found guilty of false accusation and must pay the prescribed penalties. The penalties are exactly what you expected, which doesn't make them any easier to bear. Compensation to Godwin for the original dispute, plus additional damages for the false accusation. Court cost for all the officials involved in supervising the combat. A fine to the local authority for disturbing the peace with your frivolous challenge. The total comes to more money than you typically earned in 2 months, which means you'll be working to pay off this debt for the rest of the year. Medieval justice was expensive, and the costs fell entirely on the guilty party. But the financial penalties are only part of the judgment. The magistrate also formally declares that your reputation for honesty has been legally destroyed. This isn't just social consequences. It's an official legal finding that will be recorded in the town's records and could be referenced in future legal proceedings. Medieval society kept careful track of legal judgments, especially those involving dishonesty or moral failings. If you were ever involved in another legal dispute, your previous defeat in trial by combat would be considered evidence of your unreliable character. The clerk reads back the final judgment in formal Latin, then translates it into the local language for your benefit. You are required to acknowledge that you understand the terms and accept the penalties. There's no appeal process in medieval justice. The judgment of divine combat is final and absolute. You sign the document with a mark since you can't read or write. Medieval literacy was limited to clergy, nobles, and wealthy merchants. Common people like yourself conducted business through verbal agreements and personal reputation, which made the destruction of your credibility even more devastating. The magistrate stamps the document with his official seal, a brass disc that leaves an impression in warm wax. The seal makes the judgment legally binding and enforceable throughout the region. If you tried to flee without paying the penalties, other authorities would be legally obligated to help collect the debt. Medieval legal systems were surprisingly sophisticated when it came to enforcing judgments. Networks of magistrates, bailiffs, and local officials could track debtors across considerable distances. Running away from legal obligations was possible, but difficult and dangerous. As you leave the magistrate's chamber, you're given a copy of the judgment written on a small piece of parchment. This document officially records your defeat and the associated penalties. You're required to present it to any future legal authorities who might question your status or reputation. Carrying proof of your own legal defeat feels like carrying a sign announcing your dishonesty to the world. But medieval society insisted on documentation even for its most humiliating legal procedures. The practical implications of the judgment extend far beyond the immediate financial costs. Local merchants will now know officially that you've been proven dishonest through divine judgment. This will affect your ability to conduct business, obtain credit, or even buy food on anything other than immediate payment. Medieval commerce relied heavily on trust and reputation. Merchants extended credit to customers they knew and trusted and accepted promises of future payment from those with good reputations. A legal finding of dishonesty effectively excluded you from these informal credit networks. Landlords will also be aware of your changed legal status. If you need to move to different lodgings, they'll require additional security deposits or guarantees of payment. Some might refuse to rent to you entirely, preferring tenants with unblemished reputations. Employment opportunities will be similarly affected. Employers valued honesty and reliability above almost all other qualities, and a legal judgment of dishonesty was a permanent mark against your character. You might find yourself limited to the least desirable jobs, those that desperate or disreputable people typically performed. Even social relationships will change. Marriage prospects will be severely limited. Few families would want to ally themselves with someone who had been proven dishonest through divine judgment. Friendships might survive, but business partnerships and formal social connections would likely be severed. Medieval society was built on interconnected networks of trust, reputation, and mutual obligation. Legal defeat in trial by combat didn't just affect your relationship with your immediate opponent, it changed your relationship with the entire community. The judgment also establishes a legal precedent for future disputes. If anyone else ever questions your honesty or reliability, they can point to this recorded defeat as evidence of your questionable character. Medieval justice created permanent records that followed people throughout their lives. As you walk home through the market square, clutching your copy of the legal judgment, you notice that people's behavior toward you has already begun to change. Conversations stop when you approach. Merchants eye you suspiciously when you examine their goods. Children point and whisper, having heard stories about the man who tried to cheat the turnip seller. Your defeat in trial by combat was public witness by dozens of people who are now spreading the story throughout the community. Medieval society had no mass media but gossip, and word-of-mouth communication were remarkably efficient at spreading news, especially news involving scandal or moral failure. The legal process is complete, but the social consequences are just beginning. You've been officially branded as dishonest by medieval justice, and that brand will follow you for the rest of your life. Whether you actually shortchanged Godwin in the first place has become irrelevant. The legal system has spoken through trial by combat, and its judgment is final, absolute, and permanent. A week has passed since your legal defeat, and you're beginning to understand how thoroughly medieval justice could destroy a life without actually ending it. The physical wounds from the combat have healed. A few bruises, some strained muscles, nothing that time and rest couldn't repair. But the social and economic wounds are proving far more persistent and painful. Your landlord has informed you that your rent will be increased when the current payment period ends. He hasn't explicitly stated that this is because of your legal defeat, but the timing makes his motivation clear. Medieval landlords were practical people who understood that tenants with damaged reputations might have difficulty paying their obligations. The increase isn't enormous, perhaps 20% above the current rate, but it's enough to strain your already tight finances. Combined with the debt from your legal penalties, you're facing the prospect of working longer hours for less disposable income, all because you couldn't stay upright on wet grass during a sword fight. Your regular customers have begun paying more attention to their change when they buy your services. As a craftsman who repairs leather goods, belts, shoes, harnesses, and other items that medieval people used daily, you've always operated on trust. Customers would leave items for repair and return later to collect them, often paying based on verbal agreements about the cost of work. Now they want detailed explanations of charges, itemized lists of materials used, and immediate payment upon completion of work. Some have begun taking their business elsewhere, preferring to deal with craftsmen whose honesty hadn't been legally questioned. Medieval commerce was built on personal relationships and community trust. A reputation for reliability and fair dealing was worth more than any amount of skill or craftsmanship. You could be the finest leather worker in the region, but it wouldn't matter if customers didn't trust you with their property or money. The social isolation is perhaps even more difficult to bear than the financial consequences. Medieval communities were small, tightly knit societies where everyone knew everyone else's business. Being branded as dishonest through legal judgment didn't just affect your business relationships, it changed your entire social position. Invitations to community gatherings have stopped arriving. When you attend church services, people avoid sitting near you. Conversations stop when you approach groups of neighbors. Children are warned not to play near your workshop, as if dishonesty might be contagious. Medieval society had clear hierarchies and social expectations, but it also provided a sense of belonging and community identity for those who followed the rules and maintained their reputations. Legal defeat and trial by combat effectively excluded you from this social fabric, making you an outsider in your own community. The psychological impact is harder to quantify, but no less real. Medieval people had strong beliefs about divine justice and moral order. Your defeat in combat wasn't just a legal setback, it was evidence that God Himself had found you wanting. This created a spiritual crisis that went far beyond the immediate practical consequences. If divine judgment had declared you a liar and a cheat, what did that say about your moral character? Were you actually dishonest even if you didn't remember cheating? Godwin? Had you committed other sins that you weren't aware of? Was your defeat punishment for moral failings that extended beyond the turnip transaction? Medieval Christianity taught that God was just and that divine judgment was always accurate. If you had been defeated in legal combat, it must be because you deserved defeat. This logic created a crushing sense of guilt and self-doubt that was almost impossible to resolve. The ripple effects extend to your family relationships as well. If you had been married, your spouse would share the social stigma of your defeat. Children would be taunted about their dishonest father. Extended family members might distance themselves to protect their own reputations. Medieval society held families collectively responsible for the actions of their members. A man's dishonesty reflected poorly on his entire kinship network, potentially affecting marriage prospects, business opportunities, and social standing for siblings, cousins, and other relatives. Even your professional relationships with other craftsmen have been affected. The guild system that regulated medieval trades was built on mutual trust and shared reputation. Members were expected to maintain high standards of honesty and craftsmanship, both to protect the guild's collective reputation and to ensure fair competition. Your legal defeat raises questions about your fitness for guild membership. Other leather workers might petition to have you expelled from the organization, arguing that your presence damages the reputation of all guild members. Without guild membership, you would lose access to raw materials, trading privileges, and the professional networks that made your craft economically viable. The guildmaster has already spoken to you privately about the situation. He's not unsympathetic, but he's also responsible for protecting the organization's reputation. If too many guild members complain about your continued membership, he might be forced to take disciplinary action. Medieval guilds were economic and social organizations that provided both opportunity and security for their members. Expulsion from a guild was almost as devastating as the original legal defeat, effectively ending your ability to practice your trade professionally. As you sit in your workshop late at night, working by candlelight to complete the few orders you still have, you reflect on how quickly and completely your life has changed. A week ago, you were a respected craftsman with a stable business and secure place in the community. Now you're a social outcast struggling to pay debts and maintain your livelihood. The most frustrating aspect is that none of this has anything to do with your actual character or actions. You still maintain that you didn't cheat Godwin, and your defeat in combat proved nothing except that he was better with a sword. But medieval justice didn't distinguish between combat skill and moral truth, and the consequences were the same regardless of actual guilt or innocence. Medieval society valued certainty over accuracy, finality over fairness. Your trial by combat provided both certainty and finality, even if it failed to provide justice in any meaningful sense. The system worked exactly as designed, which didn't make its results any less devastating for those who fell victim to its peculiar logic. Tomorrow, you'll wake up and continue the slow process of rebuilding your life, paying off your debts, and somehow finding a way to survive in a community that now knows you as a proven liar. Whether you can succeed remains to be seen, but at least you're alive to make the attempt, which, given the alternatives offered by medieval justice, might be the best outcome you could have hoped for. 6 months have passed since your trial by combat, and you're finally beginning to understand the true genius and horror of medieval justice. The immediate crisis has passed, your debts are nearly paid, you've found ways to maintain your business despite your damaged reputation, and you've learned to live with the social isolation that comes with being a proven liar. But the deeper implications of the system you experienced continue to reveal themselves like layers of an onion that smell worse the deeper you peel. You've had time to observe how trial by combat functions within the broader framework of medieval society, and what you've learned is both fascinating and disturbing. The system isn't actually about determining truth or dispensing justice in any sense that modern people would recognize. It's about maintaining social order through the controlled application of violence and the careful management of reputation. Medieval communities were small, isolated, and vulnerable. They couldn't afford prolonged disputes that might divide the population or weaken social cohesion. When conflicts arose, and they inevitably did, the community needed quick, definitive resolutions that everyone would accept, even if those resolutions weren't necessarily fair or accurate. Trial by combat provided exactly that kind of resolution. It transformed disputes into entertainment legal proceedings, into public spectacles, and justice into a form of community theater. The actual facts of any given case mattered less than the certainty and finality of the outcome. Your defeat in combat didn't prove that you had cheated Godwin, but it did prove that the community no longer needed to worry about your dispute. The matter was settled definitively and permanently in a way that everyone could understand and accept. Whether justice was served in any objective sense was irrelevant. Social order had been maintained. The psychological impact of the system was equally important. Medieval people lived with constant uncertainty about weather crops, disease, war, and 100 other factors beyond their control. Legal disputes added another layer of uncertainty, another source of stress and anxiety for communities that were already struggling to survive. Trial by combat eliminated that uncertainty through divine judgment. God Himself had spoken through the outcome of physical combat, providing not just a legal resolution, but a spiritual one. The winner had been blessed with victory, the loser had been found wanting, and the moral order of the universe had been publicly confirmed. This spiritual dimension made the system far more powerful than simple arbitration or negotiation. When you lost your combat with Godwin, you weren't just defeated in a legal dispute, you were rejected by God Himself. The psychological impact of that rejection was profound and lasting, far more effective than any fine or punishment that human authorities might impose. Your continuing social isolation demonstrates how well the system works to enforce its judgments. You don't need to be imprisoned or physically punished because the community itself has become your prison. Everyone knows your status as a proven liar. Everyone treats you accordingly, and everyone participates in enforcing your punishment through social exclusion. Medieval society was remarkably efficient at creating and maintaining these informal systems of social control. Legal judgments were enforced not just by official authorities, but by every merchant who demanded cash payment, every neighbor who avoided conversation, every potential marriage partner who looked elsewhere for companionship. The economic consequences continue to compound as well. Your reduced income has forced you to take on additional work, often of lower quality and lower pay. You've had to accept customers and projects that more reputable craftsmen would refuse, gradually pushing you toward the margins of your profession. This economic marginalization is part of the system's design. Medieval justice didn't just punish individual wrongdoers. It created economic incentives for honest behavior. The costs of legal defeat were so severe that most people would go to extraordinary lengths to avoid them, even if it meant accepting unfair treatment or swallowing their pride. Your experience with Godwin is a perfect example. If you had simply paid the disputed amount, regardless of whether you actually owed it, you would have avoided all the subsequent consequences of trial by combat. The system encouraged submission to accusation rather than resistance, dispute avoidance, rather than dispute resolution. From the community's perspective, this was ideal. Fewer disputes meant less social tension, fewer demands on legal resources, and more energy available for productive activities like farming, crafting, and trade. The threat of trial by combat discouraged frivolous accusations and encouraged quick settlements of legitimate disputes, but it also encouraged bullying and exploitation. People like Godwin could make unfair demands knowing that their victims might prefer to pay rather than risk everything in combat. The system protected the community's peace at the expense of individual justice, prioritizing social harmony over personal rights. Medieval legal philosophy explicitly recognized this trade-off. Individual rights, as modern people understand them, were a luxury that medieval communities couldn't afford. Survival required cooperation, and cooperation required mechanisms for resolving disputes quickly and definitively, even if those mechanisms weren't always fair to the individuals involved. Your story has become part of the community's collective memory, a cautionary tale told to illustrate the dangers of dishonesty and the certainty of divine justice. Children learn about the man who tried to cheat the turnip seller and was struck down by God's judgment. Your defeat has become a moral lesson, a piece of social education that reinforces community values. This transformation of personal tragedy into public instruction is another feature of medieval justice. Individual suffering served collective purposes, and personal loss became community gain. Your humiliation taught others about the importance of honesty, the certainty of divine judgment, and the consequences of challenging established social relationships. The irony, of course, is that you still maintain your innocence of the original charge, but your actual guilt or innocence has become irrelevant to the story's moral function. What matters is that the community believes in divine justice, fears the consequences of dishonesty, and accepts the authority of trial by combat to determine truth. Medieval society was built on shared beliefs rather than objective facts. As long as everyone agreed that trial by combat revealed divine will, the system worked effectively to maintain order and resolve disputes. The accuracy of any individual judgment mattered less than the community's faith in the process. Your continuing presence in the community serves as a living reminder of these beliefs. Every time someone sees you, they're reminded that dishonesty leads to defeat, that divine justice is certain, and that social order depends on moral behavior. Your punishment continues to serve social purposes long after the original dispute has been forgotten. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of medieval justice, its ability to transform individual punishment into ongoing social education. Your defeat wasn't just a resolution of your dispute with Godwin, it was an investment in community values that will continue paying dividends for years to come. As you work late into the night struggling to complete enough projects to pay for food and rent, you can't help but admire the terrible efficiency of the system that destroyed your life. It's cruel, unfair, and based on the absurd notion that combat skill reveals moral truth, but it works exactly as designed, providing certainty, finality, and social education through the controlled application of violence and humiliation. Whether that makes it justice in any meaningful sense is a question you're no longer qualified to answer. According to divine judgment rendered through trial by combat, your opinions on justice have been permanently discredited. The turnips, it turns out, were just the beginning. Years have passed since your trial by combat, though you've stopped counting exactly how many. Time moves differently when you're living on the margins of society, when each day is focused on immediate survival rather than long-term planning. The acute pain of your defeat has faded into a dull, persistent ache, like an old wound that aches when the weather changes. You're older now, grayer, more bent from years of working longer hours for less money. Your hands show the accumulated scars of your trade, small cuts from leatherworking tools, burns from hot metal calluses, from handling rough materials. They're the hands of someone who has worked for every coin, earned every meal, and learned to value simple survival over grander ambitions. Your reputation never recovered, of course. Medieval society had long memories for public failures, and your defeat in trial by combat remained part of the community's collective knowledge. New residents learned your story from older neighbors. Children were told about the man who tried to cheat the turnip seller and was struck down by God's justice. But something interesting happened over the years. As the community grew and changed, as people moved away and others arrived, your story began to evolve. The details became less precise, the moral lessons more generalized. You transformed from a specific individual who had committed a particular crime into a generic symbol of dishonesty punished by divine justice. This transformation was oddly liberating. People still knew your story, but they increasingly forgot your face. You became a cautionary tale rather than a specific person, a moral lesson rather than a fellow human being struggling to survive. The social isolation remained, but it became less personal, more ritualistic. Medieval society was remarkably good at absorbing individual tragedies into collective wisdom. Your suffering served educational purposes that extended far beyond your original dispute with Godwin. Children learned about honesty, adults were reminded of the consequences of moral failure, and the community reinforced its shared values through the retelling of your defeat. The irony is that you've had more time to think about justice law and social order than most people ever get. Your position on the margins of society has given you a unique perspective on how medieval communities actually function, how power operates, and how individual lives are shaped by collective decisions. You've observed that trial by combat, for all its apparent irrationality, serves important social functions that more sophisticated legal systems might not address as effectively. It provides certainty in an uncertain world, finality in situations that might otherwise fester indefinitely, and community involvement in the resolution of disputes. Medieval people lived with constant insecurity about food, weather, disease, war, and countless other factors beyond their control. Legal uncertainty was just another form of insecurity, another source of stress and anxiety that communities could ill afford. Trial by combat eliminated that uncertainty through divine judgment, providing not just legal resolution, but spiritual comfort. The system also reinforced important social values through public demonstration. Every trial by combat was a community event that taught lessons about honor, honesty, courage, and divine justice. These lessons were more powerful when illustrated through actual combat than when simply preached from pulpits or written in books that most people couldn't read. Your defeat taught the community that dishonesty would be punished, that divine justice was certain, and that social order depended on moral behavior. These were valuable lessons that contributed to community stability and cohesion, even if they were purchased at the cost of individual fairness. But you've also learned about the system's fundamental limitations and contradictions. Trial by combat confused physical ability with moral truth, combat skill with divine favor, and social utility with individual justice. It provided certainty at the expense of accuracy, finality at the cost of fairness. The system worked well for the community, but poorly for individuals caught in its machinery. Like many medieval institutions, it prioritized collective needs over personal rights, social stability over individual justice, and practical outcomes over abstract principles. Medieval society couldn't afford the luxury of perfect justice. Communities were too small resources, too limited, and survival too precarious to support elaborate legal systems focused on determining absolute truth. Trial by combat was a practical solution to practical problems, even if it occasionally destroyed innocent lives in the process. Your story illustrates both the strengths and weaknesses of medieval justice. The system resolved your dispute with Godwin quickly and definitively provided the community with valuable moral instruction and reinforced social values that contributed to collective survival. But it also destroyed your reputation, damaged your economic prospects, and condemned you to years of social isolation based on a legal judgment that proved nothing about your actual guilt or innocence. Whether this constitutes justice in any meaningful sense depends on how you define justice itself. If justice means accurate determination of truth and appropriate punishment of wrongdoing, then medieval trial by combat was a dismal failure. But if justice means effective resolution of social conflicts and reinforcement of community values, then the system worked exactly as intended. Medieval people would have found modern debates about individual rights and perfect justice largely incomprehensible. They lived in a world where survival required cooperation. Cooperation required order, and order required mechanisms for resolving disputes quickly and definitively. The accuracy of any individual judgment mattered less than the system's ability to maintain social stability. Your defeat in trial by combat wasn't really about you or about Godwin or even about the disputed turnips. It was about the community's need to demonstrate that disputes would be resolved, that moral behavior would be rewarded, and that social order would be maintained through divine judgment rendered visible through physical combat. You were simply the individual chosen by circumstance to illustrate these broader social truths. Your personal tragedy served collective purposes, and your individual suffering contributed to community education. Medieval justice was never about individuals. It was about society, and society's needs always took precedence over personal concerns. As you sit in your small workshop on another cold evening, working by candlelight to complete yet another repair job, you reflect on the strange journey that brought you to this place. You started as an honest craftsman trying to buy turnips, and you've ended as a living symbol of dishonesty defeated by divine justice. The transformation wasn't fair, but fairness was never really the point. Medieval society needed moral lessons more than it needed perfect justice, social stability more than individual rights, and practical solutions more than abstract principles. Your story provided all of these things, even if it destroyed your life in the process. Perhaps that's the most important lesson of medieval justice. It was never really about justice at all. It was about order, stability, and the collective needs of communities struggling to survive in a dangerous and uncertain world. Individual tragedies like yours were simply the price that medieval society was willing to pay for these broader social benefits. The turnips have long since been eaten, the original dispute, forgotten by everyone except you. But the lessons of your defeat continue to serve the community, teaching new generations about honesty, divine justice, and the consequences of moral failure. Your personal tragedy has become part of the community's eternal wisdom, a cautionary tale that will outlive you and everyone who witnessed your original combat. In its own strange way, that might be the closest thing to immortality that medieval society could offer. Not the immortality of personal glory or individual achievement, but the immortality of moral instruction, of lessons learned through suffering and preserved through storytelling. Your name will be forgotten, but your story will endure. Future generations will learn about the man who challenged the turnip seller and was struck down by God's justice, even if they never learned that his name was yours or that he maintained his innocence until the end. Perhaps in a world where individual lives were brief and often brutal, that kind of educational immortality was the best form of justice that medieval society could provide. Your suffering served purposes larger than yourself, and your defeat contributed to social wisdom that would benefit people you would never meet. It's not the justice you wanted, but it's the justice you received. And in medieval terms, that makes it perfect, final, and divinely ordained. The turnips, after all, were never really about turnips. Thank you for joining me on this journey through medieval justice. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep dive into trial by combat, and let me know in the comments what other aspects of medieval life you'd like to explore. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful you live in an age where vegetable disputes are settled with receipts rather than swords. While you drift off to sleep, let me leave you with some final thoughts about the strange world of medieval justice we've just explored together. Trial by combat was a real legal institution that persisted in various forms across Europe for nearly 1,000 years. It wasn't just a primitive custom that disappeared with the rise of civilization. It was a sophisticated legal mechanism that served specific social and political functions in medieval society. The practice reached its peak during the High Middle Ages, roughly from 1000 to 1300 CE, when it was formally incorporated into the legal codes of most European kingdoms. Kings and nobles didn't just tolerate trial by combat, they actively promoted it as a form of divine justice that reinforced their authority and resolved disputes without requiring extensive bureaucratic resources. The Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with the practice. Officially, Christian doctrine opposed the shedding of blood and the idea that God's will could be determined through violence. But practically, the Church often participated in trial by combat, providing priests to bless the weapons, hear confessions, and witness the proceedings. This contradiction reflects a broader tension in medieval Christianity between idealistic theology and practical necessity. Medieval society was violent by modern standards, and the Church had to find ways to work within that reality while maintaining its moral authority. Trial by combat represented a compromise, violence that was regulated, ritualized, and sanctioned by divine authority. The actual mechanics of trial by combat varied significantly across different regions and time periods. Some areas required participants to fight on foot with swords and shields, while others allowed mounted combat with lances. Some limited combat to specific social classes, while others permitted anyone to demand trial by battle. Women could participate in trial by combat, but usually through male champions who fought on their behalf. This wasn't necessarily due to assumptions about female physical weakness. Medieval society recognized that women could be effective fighters when necessary. Rather, it reflected broader social conventions about gender roles and the public performance of violence. The weapons used in trial by combat were carefully regulated and often provided by the court to ensure fairness. Participants couldn't use their personal weapons or armor beyond what was specifically permitted. This regulation was intended to make combat results depend on divine judgment rather than superior equipment. Professional champions, essentially medieval mercenaries who fought trial by combat for paying clients, became common in later periods. These specialists understood the legal and tactical aspects of judicial combat and could be hired by those who preferred not to risk their own lives in legal disputes. The decline of trial by combat began in the late medieval period as centralized royal authority grew stronger and more sophisticated legal systems developed. Kings found that judicial combat created more problems than it solved, particularly when it involved important nobles whose deaths could destabilize entire regions. The practice was gradually replaced by other forms of legal proof: witness testimony, documentary evidence, and jury trials. But it didn't disappear entirely until surprisingly late. England didn't formally abolish trial by combat until 1819, and the last recorded instance in Western Europe occurred in France in 1386. The famous combat between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Le Gris in medieval France was witnessed by thousands of spectators, including the French king, and became the subject of contemporary chronicles and modern historical novels. It demonstrated both the spectacular nature of judicial combat and its ultimate inability to determine truth. The outcome depended more on fighting skill than on the actual facts of the case. Medieval chroniclers and legal scholars were often skeptical about trial by combat, even as they participated in and recorded the practice. They understood its social utility, but questioned its theological foundations and practical accuracy. These doubts contributed to its eventual abandonment as alternative legal mechanisms became available. The psychological impact of trial by combat extended far beyond the immediate participants. Communities that witnessed judicial combat were reminded of the reality of divine judgment, the consequences of moral failure, and the importance of maintaining proper social relationships. These lessons were reinforced through storytelling, moral instruction, and community memory. Modern legal systems still struggle with many of the same problems that trial by combat was designed to address: determining truth in disputed cases, providing finality to legal proceedings, and maintaining public confidence in the justice system. Our solutions are more sophisticated, but not necessarily more effective at achieving these goals. The story of medieval trial by combat reminds us that legal systems are cultural artifacts that reflect the values, needs, and limitations of the societies that create them. What seems barbaric to modern observers made perfect sense to medieval people who lived in a world where survival required different priorities and different solutions. Perhaps most importantly, the persistence of trial by combat across centuries and cultures suggests that human societies have always struggled to balance individual rights against collective needs, perfect justice against practical necessity, and idealistic principles against realistic constraints. Medieval people weren't more violent or less intelligent than we are. They simply lived in circumstances that required different approaches to social organization and dispute resolution. Their solutions seem strange to us, but they were rational responses to the challenges of their time and place. As you settle into sleep tonight, comfortable in your warm bed, protected by modern law enforcement, and secure in your individual rights, remember that these luxuries were purchased through centuries of social evolution, technological progress, and political development. Medieval people, like our turnip-buying protagonists, lived in a world where such security was impossible, where communities survived through collective action and shared sacrifice, and where individual tragedies served larger social purposes. Their world was harder than ours, but it was also more transparent about the costs of social order and the sacrifices required for collective survival. We've learned to hide these costs behind complex institutions and abstract processes, but they haven't disappeared. They've simply been redistributed and disguised. The next time you settle a dispute through negotiation rather than combat, pay for goods with verified currency rather than personal reputation, or sleep safely without fear of legal challenge. Remember the people who lived when justice was simpler, more direct, and infinitely more dangerous. They paid for our comfort with their uncertainty, our security with their vulnerability, and our individual rights with their collective obligations. The least we can do is remember their stories and honor their sacrifices by using wisely the freedoms they never had. Sweet dreams, and may your disputes be forever settled with words rather than swords.